Okay, so it's 10 o'clock. I guess we'll get started. Thanks for coming out this morning to Drupal Camp and to my talk. I am Cassie Sharp. I am the Senior Web Developer for the Stanford School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. And I'm talking about Drupal 8 services today. So quick show of hands, how many people are Stanford affiliated here? And how many, well, the rest of you are not, so okay, about half and half. So I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about myself. Who am I, what am I doing here? I've been doing software development for quite a long time because I do so much work in support of geologists and geophysicists and climatologists and the like. I thought it would be fun to express my career in terms of geological epochs and ages. So I started out back in New York doing software development mostly for small businesses, small organizations on PC type systems, and where I got a lot of experience and a lot of professional satisfaction out of working directly with end users, developing software quickly, bringing it back to show them. It was sort of what we now call agile development. And from there, I went on to, came out to California, worked for a bunch of failed startups, such as it is, but also the wild and woolly internet development years were a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I did pick up some bad habits, but I've still managed to do some successful work for people. My early years at Stanford, starting in 2001, I was at the SLAC National Laboratory. There's a lab there called the Synchrotron Radiation Laboratory. I was with the chemistry department's macromolecular crystallography group, and I was developing web tools, which was a lot of fun and was also fairly early on in the web days, where we were setting up internet cameras in our laboratory hutches, and then we needed to set up means for multiple researchers from across the world really to be able to log in and look at the progress of their experiments. From there, I came to campus working for academic computing, student and resident services computing, and that's where I got involved with Drupal. And this was back in the days still of Drupal 5.x. Developed our first module to integrate Drupal with our Stanford WebAuth authentication system. And that was a big step in making Drupal sort of a de facto standard amongst a lot of the organizations here on campus. And then while I was there, I also managed to do a Drupal 6 version of that. And then in 2011, I came to Stanford Earth, which is where I've been since then. More Drupal integrations with university services, integration with Stanford profiles. So there are Stanford profiles for faculty, staff, students. They have a published API, so we can pull their data into our sites. Stanford Workgroups, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Integration with a room reservation system that we use here on campus called 25 Live. So basically anything that has an API, we can pull into Drupal, and we use that to integrate these campus services into our websites. And then finally, a lot of Drupal migrations from Drupal 6 to 7 and now to 8. And our most recent work has been moving our main site in Drupal 8 from our own on-premises server up to the cloud using Acquia. So that's been interesting. Again, my cowboy coding habits have had to go into the background because I can no longer just log into the server and tweak things. And instead we adhere to a more rigorous build process, which again, everything in its time and place. So it's all good. So moving on, I'm sure you're all wondering why I put services in quotes in my title. And the thing is, if you go to Google and search for Drupal services, the first thing you're going to find is a list of consulting service agencies. And the next thing you're going to find is a reference to a Drupal module called services, which has been around since at least Drupal 6. We used to use that as a way to share information amongst different Drupal sites. And it's sort of an early iteration or version of sort of a feeds or an API type module. What we mean though when we talk about services in Drupal 8 is something very different. Drupal 8 is built on top of a PHP framework called Symfony, which provides lots of great tools, lots of controller view interfaces, lots of things that make application development easier. So the idea of services and a service container is something that comes from Symfony. My recommendation, if you're learning, getting started in coding for Drupal 8, a lot is the same, but taking some time to learn about the underlying Symfony framework is definitely a good use of one's time. So anyway, in Symfony / Drupal 8, a service is essentially tautologically any object that is managed by the services container, but more specifically, it's an object that provides some reusable functionality. So an object that connects to the database, an object that you can use to send an email, an object to get information about the current authenticated user. And this is sometimes creating these objects like a database connection are they're kind of resource heavy. They take up memory. They take time. So the services container is a special array that essentially manages those objects for you. So they get instantiated just once, and they're globally available to your application in a variety of ways. So services essentially in Drupal replace the use of global variables and functions. So for example, in Drupal 6 and 7, let's say, and this is a kind of a silly example, let's say when an authenticated user wants to view an event, one of our Stanford events pages, we want to grab the user's name and write it to the session. So in Drupal 7, we would access the global user object by saying global $user, and we would look in that object for the UID, see if it's greater than 0. Then we would look at the, let me step back here. This is using a Drupal hook node view. So in Drupal, everyone familiar with using Drupal hooks? Anyone not familiar? All right, well, so in Drupal, and this is true through the early versions of Drupal and into Drupal 8, Drupal will essentially fire off events when things happen, when a user wants to view a page or when a user logs in or any number of things. And what Drupal will do is it will query any modules, any contributed or custom modules with hooks, and it will send out, so for in this example, the user wants to view a node, Drupal fires off this hook node view, and then any module, any custom module that has implemented a function called myModule node view will get called, and it will get past the node that's being viewed by the user. So in this case, and this is all happening globally. It's all procedural code. We're using the global user object. We're using objects, the node object, the user object. They're not classes. They're just objects with data in them. So we come into our function. We check if the user is authenticated. We'll then check the node type and the view mode, and then we're going to grab the name of the user from the user object, and we're going to write it to the session. And again, we're just using PHP's global session array. So this works. It'll do what it says to do, but it's not really considered the best practices in terms of coding these days. So in Drupal 8, we can do the same thing using services to make this more object-oriented. And we're still using Drupal hooks. We're still, instead of a node view hook, we now have something called an entity view hook, which I believe is actually, this also comes from Drupal 7, but in Drupal 8, it's really the only way to go. And some of your code in Drupal 8 is going to get a little bit more complicated because everything is object-oriented and using namespaces, so you need to declare when you're using an object. So those are those use statements at the top, and they're similar to include statements in older code. But instead of including a PHP file, you're using an object that's been created and declared and is in use somewhere. So then I'm going to have my entity view hook, which Drupal will still call in the same way. So a lot of Drupal code, even though we're based on Symfony and we're object-oriented, a lot of the hooks are still there. A lot of code still requires that you use those hooks. Things like the install update hooks when you modify something and you want to run the update routine still uses the same hooks. If you want to see when a user logs in, you still use the user login hook, that kind of thing. There's Symfony functionality for dispatching events that work differently, but not. And some modules like the Migrate Plus contributed module for migrations uses that, and that's great. But now you're dealing with two different ways of basically capturing events and acting on them. But that's all fine. So anyway, here in the new code, we're going to access our user, our logged in user, by calling a service. And I mentioned this service container. There's one service container for your entire Drupal application called Drupal. So /Drupal : service will give you access to any of the declared services. /Drupal means it's a global object. Services, one of its is a static function. Current user in this case is the current user service, and what that does is it returns a user object. So that's similar to our old global $user object, but in this case, it is a full-on class. It's got properties and methods. You can extend it. You can do whatever you can want to do in coding with objects. So in this case now we have our user object. Instead of checking the user ID directly, we can call one of its member functions, which is authenticated. If that's true, then we can look at our entity, and again, instead of just a node object that's just fields, this is an entity object that has methods and properties, and we can query it to see if our entity type is a node. In Drupal 8, or even Drupal 7 with entities, beforehand, nodes, and which are content, users, taxonomy, those are all completely separate things. In Drupal 8, they're all entities, and they can all be treated in a similar way. So we can now check if our entity is a node, if its entity type is Stanford event, if the view mode is full, that's the same. And now we want to write to the session. So again, we're going to use a service called the session service, and we're going to ask the Drupal service container to give us the session service. And then we're going to set the username from the user object into that, and the user object has something called get account name. So doing the same thing, maybe it's the code's a little more complicated, but it's more, it's operating presumably more intelligently under the hood. So there's lots of things you can do with services. As I mentioned, many of your favorite hooks are still available. There are some common services that can be accessed by different names. So for example, where I said Drupal service current user, you could also just ask for Drupal : current user, and it'll do the same thing. But for the other example of session, there is no equivalent for session. So in that case, you have to ask specifically for the service with the service tag. There are lots of services available. Some of the other ones I've used, I mentioned the database. So the database service will return a connection to your underlying database. So you don't have to manage multiple connections. There's a mail manager for sending emails. There's a logger service that basically replaces the watchdog functionality in older versions of Drupal. And then there's a really handy one called page cache kill switch. And sometimes you want to generate a page, a custom page, or it's just doing a redirect or something. You don't want that to go into the page cache, because that will cause problems for perhaps anonymous users or somebody switching back and forth. So you can actually call this service at the top of the code, and we'll get into that. That generates a page where you say Drupal service, page cache, kill switch trigger, and then whatever you generate will not go into the cache. So lots of ways to get your lists of core services. There is a page. Services are defined or configured to the system, registered with the system, essentially through a services YAML file. And you can go to the Drupal API site, and you can just look at that services file and see the list of the many, many services that are there. If you don't want to remember that URL, you can just go to the api.drupal.org and search for core.services. You can also, unfortunately, this is hidden by the Zoom bar there, but you can actually go to Drush in your console and say Drush, I believe the command is drush devel :services, and it will just print out a list of all the services that are currently available in your current site. So that's one way to access services, and that's the easiest, perhaps most straightforward way if you're familiar with coding to Drupal hooks, where you can access those services directly. The other way is a little more complicated, and it's considered the quote-unquote right way to access services, and that's using something called dependency injection, which is one of those concepts that took me quite a while to understand. So in Drupal 7, if you were going to generate a custom page, like some dynamic content, just some output, you would declare a path to that page or URL using hook menu, and you would declare your path /admin/ whatever, Stanford Earth /test. And then you would give it a callback function, which it was just a regular PHP function. And you'd use that to generate your output. In Drupal 8, it's using a concept from Symfony called controllers. So for both controllers and Drupal forms, you're writing classes that generate your output, and then you're linking them to paths with a special configuration file called the routing.yaml file. Now, within these classes, you can actually still access your global Drupal service container the same way with \Drupal. And it works fine, but it's not considered a best practice to do that. If you use like a code sniffer to check that your code is correct, it'll complain about doing that, and it will tell you that you should be using dependency injection instead. So this technique, dependency injection, the idea behind it is that instead of your main application calling a function to do something, the main application is instead going to call, it doesn't know what it's going to call essentially, that there's going to be some interface declared, and then your custom code, instead of writing an application, you're writing basically just a plugin that adheres to that interface, and you're injecting it into the application, which then knows how to call it. And the idea there is that way you can swap out code for other modules. Frankly, I never had to do that. I don't know anyone who has, but that's the capability, and that's how the quote-unquote best practice is defined. So in dependency injection, your service is the dependency, and your application, your controller, or your form, your output vehicle is the dependent class, and you are injecting the service into that class. And you do that a couple of different ways. Of course, there's a special function in your class file called create, where you access the services container directly and pull out the services you want. Or there's also another way to do that using a configuration file called services.yaml. So an example of doing the dependency injection via create, this would be a controller that's going to do some migration, some Stanford profiles imports into our site. So the output of this controller is going to be a Drupal batch that will then run through a bunch of different migrations and do those imports. So what I need to run this controller, I need some services from the container, which are the manager, the migration manager controller, the database controller, and the configuration controller. And Drupal has a lot of information in configurations that's sort of analogous to the variables table in older versions of Drupal. So we would have a create function that pulls in those services, passes them to the class constructor, where they're then stored in the object and used. So that's the slightly more complicated way of doing things, and maybe I'll be able to show you how that works when I'm done with the presentation. Um, so, excuse me, just check the time here. Wow, I'm really moving on. So once you've mastered the idea of using these services, there may come a point where you want to create a service of your own, which happened with me recently. At Stanford, we use something called workgroups. And everybody associated with Stanford, faculty, staff, students, whoever, everybody gets an 8-character, what's called a SUNET ID. And you create that, you pick your own when you come in, and that follows you through your entire time at Stanford, and they tell you to choose carefully. I worked with somebody who had been a freshman here and was still stuck with his rather embarrassing SUNET ID. But what we also have is something called the Workgroup Manager, and you can go in and you can basically organize people by SUNET ID into any sorts of custom work groups. And we use that at Stanford Earth to organize our departments and our people types. So we'll have these nested work groups of faculty, department, faculty, regular, department, faculty, emeritus, department, student, graduate, so forth. And you can then nest these together and combine them in different ways. And we use that to create searchable like phone directories and mailing lists and other sorts of things. And luckily for us, there is a Workgroup API, which we don't often need to access directly because a lot of the other services that we're already using, like Stanford Profiles, are already using that in their back end. But I found that I had a need for accessing a work group directly. And basically what I wanted, I just wanted to pass the API the work group name, and I wanted to get a list of people in the work group. Pretty simple. The Workgroup API returns an XML file. It can have, it doesn't, it shows the nested work groups, it shows the administrators. You need to sort of pick through that and find the stuff, the actual people that you want. And then the other wrinkle is that the API requires a certificate and key to work, so it makes it kind of hard to like test it from the browser. So in Drupal 7, I had written some procedural code to do that. It was kind of clunky, kind of hard to call. What I really wanted was a service where I could say service, define my service as Stanford Earth workgroups.workgroup, and I just have a member function of that service called get members. I pass it the workgroup name, and it just returns a nice array of the people in the workgroup. So I thought, well, let's see if I can build a service. What we need for that, we're creating a custom Drupal module, just like we've always done. It's going to have an info file to register the module, and it's going to have a module file, which is just a PHP file to handle our Drupal hooks, just like we've always had in Drupal. And then in addition to that, we're going to add a services file. So a Stanford Earth workgroups.services YAML, where it defines the name of the service, and then the class, the class file that's going to be associated with that, and then the arguments that you want the system to automatically pass to that service when it gets instantiated. And what's nice is here you can pass it other services, and you do that in an arguments parameter. Each of the arguments is prepended with an @ sign, which tells Drupal that these are services. And so then when Drupal starts, when the first time I call my workgroup service, Drupal will call its constructor and pass it all these other services. And I went, I'm using more services here than I probably need, but I just wanted to make it work. So the other things we need for this module, which really have nothing to do with it being a service, but because making a call to the API does require these certificates, that they be somewhere on my server outside of the usual doc route. So we need a configuration form where we can tell it where to find our certificate files. And it also lets us test that that's working by just entering a workgroup name. Then there are other supporting files that in Drupal 8 you may have for module development, routing file to specify paths, links.menu file if you want to add one of those paths to a Drupal menu, to like a drop-down menu or whatever. And then the class file for the form, which in this case is Stanford Earth Workgroups config. I'm going to make all this code available on GitHub, by the way, if you want to look at it. So then finally, the service class itself, as I mentioned, there will be a constructor. We're going to depend upon the service manager to pass in all these other services to it. And then when I query the API for the workgroup information, it will call the get members function and then do its thing. And I'm going to show you, I think I have time to do a quick demo. So the full module, and we'll post the slides, the full module can be found at GitHub, Stanford Earth, Workgroups, etc. If you're a Stanford person and you want to get access to the Workgroup API, you can file a help ticket to get the certificates that you need. I will find there's a link for the administrative systems site where they tell you what else you need to do. And then once you have this service, you can access it anywhere in your code by just calling it with the get members function. So that's the presentation. I have time to do a quick demo, but does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Just a kind of general question. If you were interested, someone's interested in doing more about services, besides just kind of documentation examples, are there any good tutorials or other resources?
I did find a few on just by Googling. I found a couple of tutorials. They are very kind of high-end. Here's a really basic service, and some of them are a little confusing. It still takes a little bit of digging and playing with it and trying stuff out to really get the hang of it. My experience anyway. But if I can find some of the tutorials that I use, I can post those links as well.
Okay, great.
Or just email me, @sharp. So I'm gonna see if I can get. Let's see. How do I don't want to stop my Zoom here. So I have. Okay, so I have running on my laptop, I have a MAMP web service. I've got my code in PHP Storm with the debugger on. So I'm going to do, and I created a test page this morning that basically will just call my workgroup service and return the workgroups to me. So in this case, I have in my configuration, and it's very slow because it's doing all this debug stuff, and it's an old laptop. And boy, it's really slow. Hello. Wonder if it's caught on the debugger. Technology, am I right? All right, I was going to show you the configuration page, but that's really, that's actually a little bit outside the scope of this talk because I am supposedly focusing on services. So what I did is I created a page called, and I did this using a controller called Workgroup Test, and it takes a parameter, WG, and then the name of a work group, which in this case is Earth Sci Geophysics Students Graduate. And when I call that, now my debugger catches the this is my controller for this page. And so the first thing it gets called is its create function because I'm using dependency injection. And I'm going to get these services from the services container, which are my page cache kill switch that I mentioned earlier, my workgroup services that I built, and the request stack from Symfony, which has my URL parameters and so forth in it. So the first thing that happens is Drupal calls this create function, which then calls my Earth Workgroup Services constructor. And I mentioned that these things get instantiated once per Drupal request. So this is the first time it's being requested. And in this, I have this long list of of services that I'm getting for that, which are not coming from that create function. They are instead coming from the workgroup services YAML file and those arguments that I showed you. So, oops, let me go back to the code again. So my constructor is basically getting all these services and storing them in the object. Then it's going back to my controller and it's running that constructor. It already got the workgroup service and it's basically constructing the object. And then my call to that URL through a routing file, it's now calling in my controller this basically function called content, which is where you can build any kind of custom content that you want and pass it back to Drupal for rendering and display. So I'm going to use my kill switch. Sorry, I'm not used to the screen being this small. I'm going to get my workgroup argument from the URL, and I'm going to do this by calling the request stack, and then get the current request, and then get the workgroup argument, and then I'm going to sanitize it with HTML special characters. I actually am not sure if Symfony does that for you already or not, but it never hurts. And so now I have my workgroup variable, Earth Sci Geophysics Students Graduate. And then I called my service get members function. So now I'm back in my workgroup services file. Inside that object, the member function get members. I passed it the workgroup name. You can also, if you want to just pass it the locations of your certificate files directly, you can do that here. I've already stored them in my configuration, so those are empty. I'm going to make sure I have that information. I get that from the configuration object, the configuration service. So now I have my key and my certificate. Make sure those aren't empty. And now I'm going to use my HTTP client service to request to the Workgroups API those members. So I make that call, check the status code on that. Then I use, this just comes straight out of PHP, simple XML load string. I use it, there's a result object that the HTTP client gave me. I get its body, run it through, loads simple XML load string. And now I have an XML object. And I'm going to look for attributes, which is for the student ID and for the username. And I'm going to build an array of those. And so there's some code in here that one would use when parsing through XML. And it will also recursively call itself little computing 101 if it finds a nested work group. And it will just merge that into the array that it's building. And then eventually it will get to this point where it's built this array of members. In this case, there's 62 graduate students. And I have, for each of them, I have their student ID and their name. And then I can return that. And I believe that's it. And then Drupal will just display the array for me. So that is a workgroup service. Let's see how we do on time. I think we're just about out of time. Any other questions? Yeah. I mean, the Drupal community itself is still doing the same thing. If you made a module available on Drupal.org, then I presume somebody. Yeah, exactly. Right. If you just put it on Git, nobody's necessarily going to look at it. I mean, what we've been doing with Stanford Earth, we've been working with Stanford Web Services. We have a process in place by which we can put something in Git, pull request, and then ask somebody for what that is. So it's, I guess within Stanford Web Services, it's a formal process. Because they were helping us with the development system originally, we were adopting that. Since then, I've been sort of working on my own. Yeah, I could still ask them to review. I'm sure they are happy with that.
Yeah, I'm just saying, is that what you would recommend?
Yeah.
If you're going to just write something,
It
maybe
is.
run a patch day or somebody at the time, maybe yourself.
Exactly. Sure.
Request. Look at my module.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I would reach out to Shay or some US or me or just first lesson.
Okay.
So there will be somebody. Want to do it that way. So else. I have not really, because something like this is so Stanford centric that I'm not sure outside of Stanford for this. I don't really have a way to say this. I guess I could say something on the group course list, but or ask SWS if they want to talk about this. But so much of my code is so focused on just what we need that I've never really had a chance to work to.
If there's there's some parts that are very Stanford specific, but there's some like the authentication things that might be more generic.
Sure. Yeah, especially now that we've moved, Stanford, our web off used to be very, very much homegrown, and now we've since moved to a more generic SAML login system, authentication system. So yeah, that could be true. But again, even then, like where we add Stanford work groups to our authentication process, again, that's a reason. Anyway, I think we're out of time. So anyway, thanks again, everyone.